To comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe that befell the Army of Northern Virginia in May 1863, one must first dismantle the marble statue of Stonewall and examine the deeply complex, arguably neurodivergent, and profoundly eccentric human being that was Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Before he was the hammer of the Confederacy, he was a figure of ridicule, a man whose personal habits and rigorous internal logic baffled his contemporaries and continue to fascinate modern historians. The trajectory of the Civil War in the Eastern Theater was irrevocably altered not just by a bullet, but by the specific psychological and physiological constitution of the man who received it. Long before the thunder of Manassas, Jackson was a professor of natural and experimental philosophy at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, in Lexington, Virginia. His tenure there, spanning a decade, provides the most fertile ground for understanding his psychological profile. He was, by nearly every primary account, an abysmal instructor. His pedagogy was rooted in a rigid, inflexible memorization of text. He would arrive in the lecture hall and recite his lessons verbatim, often staring blankly at the ceiling or a fixed point on the wall. The cadets, young men of the planter aristocracy who valued charisma and fluidity, found Jackson to be a bizarre anomaly. If a student interrupted him with a question or requested a clarification on a point of physics or artillery trajectory, Jackson was incapable of rephrasing his explanation. Instead, he would simply rewind his mental tape and repeat the previous sentence, word for word, in the same monotone cadence. This inability to adapt his communication style to the needs of his audience earned him the derisive nickname Tom Fool. The ridicule was not passive. Jackson was the subject of relentless pranks. Cadets would draw caricatures of his oversized feet on the chalkboard. They would drop bricks from the barracks windows as he passed, testing his famous composure. They would mock his rigid gait. Through it all, Jackson remained impassive, a stoic figure who seemed to exist in a reality parallel to, but distinct from, those around him. This detachment, often interpreted by his subordinates during the war as secrecy or arrogance, was likely a fundamental aspect of his neurology. Jackson's eccentricity extended deep into his physical existence. He was a man plagued by a constellation of ailments, both real and psychosomatic, which he managed with a rigorous and often bizarre set of protocols. He suffered from chronic dyspepsia, indigestion, a condition that dictated a strict and peculiar diet. He eschewed pepper, believing it induced weakness in his left leg. He avoided reading by artificial light, convinced it would damage his vision and disrupt his internal rhythms. Perhaps the most widely cited of his physiological beliefs was his theory regarding the symmetry of his body. Jackson was convinced that his internal organs were loosely attached and susceptible to shifting out of place if he did not maintain a rigid, upright posture. He believed that standing was necessary to keep his organs stacked correctly. Furthermore, he labored under the delusion that one of his arms was heavier than the other and that the blood circulation in his body was asymmetrical. To counteract this, he would frequently ride with one arm, usually the left, raised high above his head, palm open to the heavens. While his troops later interpreted this gesture as a constant, silent prayer, a sign of his communion with the divine, Jackson himself explained it as a mechanical necessity to drain the blood from the limb and lighten it. This collision of the medical and the mystical is quintessential Jackson, a man whose bizarre health regimens were misinterpreted as spiritual fervor, adding to the aura of invincibility that surrounded him. One of the most enduring images of the Civil War is that of Stonewall Jackson riding into the heat of battle while sucking on a lemon. While modern skepticism often relegates such colorful details to the realm of lost cause mythology, the historical record provides substantive evidence for this habit. Jackson developed a taste for exotic fruits during his service in the Mexican-American War, and he retained a voracious appetite for them throughout his life. Contemporaries, including Staff Officer Henry Kidd Douglas, reported seeing Jackson consume lemons, often whole, including the rind, during moments of high stress or while in the saddle. The lemon was not merely a snack, it was a medicinal tool, a digestive aid for his dyspepsia. The sight of a lieutenant general, amidst the carnage of Gaines's Mill or the Valley, calmly gnawing on a sour fruit, contributed to the perception of him as a man entirely detached from the horrors of war. In recent years, historians and medical professionals have begun to view Jackson's behaviors through a modern diagnostic lens. The rigidity of his routine, his intense focus, his social awkwardness, his lack of eye contact, and his specific sensory sensitivities align closely with the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, ASD, specifically what was formerly known as Asperger's syndrome. The Tom Fool of VMI displays classic traits of neurodivergence, the inability to deviate from a script, his lectures, the intense fixation on specific interests, artillery, theology, health regimens, and the social oblivion that allowed him to ignore the mockery of his students. This retrospective analysis is not merely academic. It explains his military prowess, his ability to focus entirely on a tactical problem, excluding all emotional or physical distractions. Hunger, cold, fatigue was a superpower on the battlefield. However, this same single-mindedness, the tunnel vision of command, would play a critical role in the tragedy at Chancellorsville. His insistence on conducting a personal reconnaissance against the advice of his staff and the dictates of safety can be seen as a manifestation of this compulsive need for direct sensory verification of the data. By the spring of 1863, the Tom Fool of VMI had been transmuted by the alchemy of war into the Stonewall of the South. He was the right hand of Robert E. Lee, the executor of audacious maneuvers that had humiliated Union commanders in the Shenandoah Valley and on the peninsula. But as May arrived, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia faced its gravest threat yet. Major General Joseph Hooker, having replaced the hapless Ambrose Burnside, had rebuilt the Army of the Potomac into a formidable machine. Hooker boasted with some justification that he commanded the finest army on the planet. His plan was operationally sound, a pincer movement designed to trap Lee's smaller force near Fredericksburg. Hooker moved the bulk of his army across the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, settling into the dense scrub oak forest known as the Wilderness, threatening Lee's rear. Lee, outnumbered more than 2-1, roughly 60,000 Confederates to Hooker's 130,000, refused to retreat. Instead, he turned west to face Hooker. By the evening of May 1, 1863, the two armies were locked in a tense standoff. Hooker, inexplicably losing his nerve, had pulled his troops back into a defensive shell around the Chancellorsville crossroads, surrendering the initiative to Lee. The night of May 1st was cool, the air thick with the scent of pine and the smoke of thousands of campfires. In a small clearing near the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Furnace Road, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson met to decide the fate of Virginia. The setting was starkly humble. Lacking camp chairs, the two generals sat on overturned cracker boxes, empty hardtack crates left behind by retreating Federal troops. This cracker box meeting is one of the pivotal moments of the war. Lee had received intelligence from his cavalry chief, J.E.B. Stuart, that the Union right flank was hanging in the air, unanchored to any natural obstacle like a river or a mountain. It was exposed. Lee asked the question that would define the battle. How can we get at those people? Jackson, who had been consulting with his topographical engineer, Jedediah Hotchkiss, and a local resident, Charles Welford, proposed a plan of breathtaking audacity. Hotchkiss had mapped a route, a series of obscure country lanes and wood paths, specifically the Brock Road, that would allow a column to march across the entire front of the Union Army, screened by the dense forest, and emerge on the unsuspecting right flank. When Lee asked what force Jackson intended to take, Jackson replied, "My whole corps." The proposal was a violation of the cardinal rules of warfare. Lee would be splitting his army in the face of a superior foe. He would be sending 30,000 men with Jackson, leaving himself with only 14,000 to hold off Hooker's main force of over 70,000. If Hooker realized Lee's weakness, he could crush the Confederate center. If he caught Jackson on the march, he could destroy the column in detail. Lee, trusting his lieutenant explicitly, gave the order. The march would begin at dawn. The morning of May 2, 1863, broke clear and hot. The march of the Second Corps was a grueling test of endurance. The route covered approximately 12 miles of narrow, rutted roads, winding through what one observer called the waste places of nature, the dark, tangled heart of the wilderness. The sensory experience of the march was hellish. The movement of 30,000 men, along with artillery and wagons, churned the dry dirt roads into a choking, blinding dust that coated the soldiers in a spectral gray powder. The heat rose into the mid-80s, exacerbated by the humidity trapped under the forest canopy. Soldiers suffered terribly from thirst. Diaries from the march record men dropping from heat stroke, gasping for air. Water was scarce. Men were driven to drink from stagnant puddles, mud holes, and ditches, sometimes even from sources contaminated by the decaying carcasses of horses. The discipline required to keep the column moving at speed, in silence under such conditions, was absolute. Jackson was everywhere, riding Little Sorrel up and down the line, his eyes burning with the blue light of battle lust. He urged the officers to press on, knowing that speed was their only security. The movement did not go entirely unnoticed. Union lookouts at Hazel Grove spotted the Confederate column moving south near Catherine Furnace. They fired artillery at the train, causing some disruption. However, the Union High Command misidentified the movement. Because the road turned south at that point, Hooker and his staff convinced themselves that Lee was retreating toward Gordonsville. "The enemy is flying," Hooker declared, his ego confirming what he hoped to see. He sent Sickles' 3rd Corps to harass the rear of the column, but he did not reorient his main line. The 18th Corps, commanded by Oliver Otis Howard, remained facing south, their flank completely exposed to the west. By late afternoon, Jackson had reached the Orange Turnpike. He was now deep in the Union rear. He had achieved the impossible. He spent the next 2 hours deploying his tired, dusty men into 3 lines of battle, stretching for 2 miles through the woods. It was 5:15 p.m. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The Union troops of the 18th Corps were cooking supper, their rifles stacked, completely unaware that the hammer was about to fall. Jackson turned to General Robert Rhodes and gave the quiet order. "You can go forward, then." The narrative pauses here, at the precipice of victory. The sun is setting, the trap is sprung, and the Confederate high tide is about to crash into the Union flank. But as the day turns to twilight, the story shifts from one of tactical brilliance to one of chaotic tragedy. The assault that Jackson launched at 5:15 p.m. on May 2nd was not merely an attack. It was a kinetic event of such violence that it shattered the psychological cohesion of the Union 18th Corps. The rebel yell, a high-pitched, terrifying shriek, erupted from 30,000 throats, rolling through the wilderness like a physical wave. The Union troops, many of them German-Americans, Dutchmen, who had been marginalized by the rest of the army, were caught in a state of total unpreparedness. They were butchering cattle, playing cards, and writing letters. When the gray line burst from the tree line, the shock was total. Regiments disintegrated before they could form a line of battle. The retreat turned into a rout, a stampede of men, horses, and wagons fleeing east down the Orange Plank Road toward Chancellorsville. Jackson pressed the attack relentlessly. "Press them! Cut them off!" he urged his commanders. He knew that the victory would only be decisive if he could sever Hooker's line of retreat to the United States Ford. He wanted to destroy the Army of the Potomac, not just push it back. However, the terrain of the wilderness began to exact its toll. As the Confederates advanced, the dense undergrowth broke up their formations. Companies became separated. Regiments lost their alignment. The sheer chaos of the pursuit, combined with the descending darkness, caused the attack to lose momentum. By 9 p.m., the Confederate front line, now consisting of A.P. Hill's division, which had moved up to relieve Rhodes's exhausted troops, had stalled near the Bullock Road. As the sun vanished, a new player entered the drama: the moon. Astronomers Don Olson and Lori Jasinski have calculated that on the night of May 2, 1863, the moon was nearly full and rose shortly after sunset. This geological fact is crucial to understanding the tragedy that followed. The moon rose in the southeast, casting a bright, silvery light over the battlefield. While this illumination offered Jackson the tantalizing possibility of continuing the attack into the night, a rarity in Civil War combat, it also created a deceptive visual landscape. The moonlight filtered through the trees, creating high-contrast shadows. It backlit figures on the road, turning them into dark, unrecognizable silhouettes to anyone looking toward the light source. Jackson, driven by his obsession with destroying the enemy, refused to let the pause in fighting become a stop. He believed that a night attack, utilizing the moonlight, could finish Hooker. He needed to know exactly where the Union lines were positioned. Against the advice of his staff, Jackson decided to ride forward of his own picket line to scout the ground personally. This decision was characteristic of his autistic need for direct sensory input. He trusted no eyes but his own. He assembled a small party, including his signal officer Captain Richard Wilborn, Captain William Cunliffe, and several couriers. They rode east, along the Orange Plank Road, passing through the lines of the 33rd North Carolina and advancing toward the 18th North Carolina Infantry, who were deployed in the dark woods to the north of the road. Jackson rode Little Sorrel, his trusted but skittish mount. The party advanced deep into the no-man's land, perhaps 200 yards beyond the Confederate pickets. In the distance, Jackson could hear the sounds of the Union Army, the ringing of axes as men desperately felled trees to build breastworks, the murmur of officers rallying their troops. He realized the enemy was digging in. Time was slipping away. He turned his horse to ride back, intending to order a general advance. He was riding back toward his own men. He was riding directly into the glare of the rising moon. The men of the 18th North Carolina Infantry were not elite veterans. They were tired, nervous soldiers holding a line in a dark, terrifying forest. They had been warned that Union cavalry was active in the area. Earlier skirmishes had put them on high alert for a counterattack. As Jackson's party rode back toward the Confederate lines, the sound of their horses' hooves on the plank road drifted toward the nervous infantrymen. To the soldiers of the 18th, peering into the gloom, the dark shapes silhouetted against the moonlight did not look like their beloved general. They looked like a squadron of Union cavalry charging down the road. Major John D. Barry of the 18th North Carolina, perceiving an imminent threat, shouted the order, "Cavalry, fire!" A sheet of flame ripped through the underbrush. The volley was devastating. It tore into the cluster of horsemen with the force of a physical blow. Captain Boswell was killed instantly, shot through the heart. Sergeant Cunliffe was also killed. Several horses went down. Jackson was struck by 3 bullets. One ball entered his right hand, smashing the knuckles and rendering the hand useless. 2 more bullets struck his left arm. One passed through the forearm, exiting near the wrist. The other, the fatal shot, shattered the humerus bone just below the left shoulder, severing the brachial artery. The impact nearly knocked Jackson from the saddle. His left arm hung useless. His right hand was mangled. He lost the reins. Little Sorrel, terrified by the sudden flash and noise, bolted, turning and tearing through the woods toward the Union lines. Jackson, fighting through the shock, managed to right himself in the saddle, catching the reins with his bloody right hand. As he struggled to control the horse, his staff officers, those who had survived the volley, rushed to him. "Pour it into them!" The tragedy was compounded by confusion. As the survivors shouted for the firing to stop, identifying themselves as friends, the panic in the Confederate line deepened. A voice from the 18th North Carolina shouted back, "It's a lie! Pour it into them, boys!" A second volley erupted. This fire struck more of the staff and horses, but Jackson, now being assisted from his horse by Captain Wilborn and Lieutenant Smith, was spared further injury from the bullets. However, he was now in a zone of extreme danger. General A.P. Hill, who had been nearby, rushed to the scene. He found Jackson lying on the ground, supported by his aides. Hill, often a rival of Jackson's, was now the picture of solicitude. He threw himself to the ground, cradling Jackson's head. "General, are you much hurt?" Hill asked. "I think I am," Jackson replied, his voice weak. "All my wounds are from my own men. I believe my arm is broken. It gives me severe pain." Hill removed Jackson's gauntlets, which were filled with blood, and applied a tourniquet to the shattered arm to stanch the bleeding. But the night was not done with them. The Union artillery, alerted by the sudden flare of musketry, opened a furious bombardment of the road. The evacuation of Stonewall Jackson from the front lines is a harrowing narrative of physical suffering and bad luck that likely sealed his fate. With the Union artillery pummeling the landscape with canister and shell, moving the wounded general was a perilous operation. A litter was hastily improvised. 4 men, staff officers and volunteers, lifted Jackson to carry him to the rear. They had to move through the thick woods to avoid the fire sweeping the road. The underbrush was a tangle of vines, roots, and saplings. As they moved through the darkness, one of the litter bearers hooked his foot on a grapevine and stumbled. The litter tipped violently. Jackson rolled off, falling from shoulder height and crashing heavily onto the ground. He landed squarely on his shattered left shoulder. A groan of agony escaped his lips, the first significant complaint he had made. The fall was catastrophic. Medical historians believe this impact caused a severe contusion to his lung, which later facilitated the pneumonia that killed him. The fall also reopened the artery, causing fresh hemorrhaging. The bearers, terrified and apologetic, scrambled to pick him up. They placed him back on the litter. One bearer, despite having his own arm broken by shrapnel during the barrage, refused to let go of the handle, displaying a grim devotion to his commander. After a torturous ambulance ride, Jackson arrived at the field hospital near the Wilderness Tavern around 2:30 a.m. on May 3rd. Dr. Hunter McGuire, the 27-year-old medical director of the 2nd Corps, took charge. McGuire's examination confirmed that the arm could not be saved. The bone was pulverized, the tissue damage extensive. He explained to Jackson that amputation was necessary. Jackson replied, "Doctor, do for me whatever you think best." McGuire administered chloroform using a cloth cone. As the anesthetic took effect, Jackson, a man who lived in constant pain and tension, finally relaxed. He murmured, "What an infinite blessing," repeating the word blessing until he slipped into unconsciousness. The surgery was standard for the time, but performed with skill. McGuire used a circular amputation method, removing the arm about 2 inches below the shoulder. The operation was successful in that the bleeding was stopped and the wound dressed. On May 4th, to keep him safe from the fluctuating battle lines, Jackson was moved 27 miles south to the Chandler plantation at Guinea Station. He was placed in a small office building on the estate. For the first few days, his recovery seemed promising. He was lucid, cheerful, and eager to talk about the battle. But by May 7th, the situation deteriorated. He complained of intense pain in his side, the side he had fallen on. Dr. McGuire diagnosed pleuropneumonia. The treatment available was limited. They used cups to bleed him and administered mercury and antimony, standard, if ineffective, treatments of the era. Jackson grew weaker. He drifted into delirium. In his delirium, the general returned to the war. He was no longer in a bed, he was in the saddle. He shouted orders to A.P. Hill and Major Hawks, his commissary officer. "Order A.P. Hill to prepare for action," he cried. "Pass the infantry to the front rapidly." Sunday, May 10th, 1863. Jackson had always expressed a desire to die on a Sunday, the Lord's Day. As the Sabbath dawned on May 10th, it became clear that his wish would be granted. His wife, Mary Anna, who had arrived with their infant daughter Julia, sat by his bedside. She told him that the doctors said he would not last the day. Jackson accepted this with his characteristic fatalism. Very good, he whispered. It is all right. At 3:15 p.m., the end came. The delirium faded. His breathing shallowed. A look of ineffable sweetness washed over his face, replacing the mask of pain. He spoke his final words, a sentence of haunting poetry that has echoed through history. Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. The narrative of the Battle of Chancellorsville did not end with Jackson's wounding. It merely changed its protagonist. With Jackson down and A.P. Hill also wounded, command of the Second Corps fell to Major General J.E.B. Stuart, the dashing cavalry commander. On the morning of May 3rd, the Army was in shock. The men knew Old Jack was down. Morale hung by a thread. Stuart, understanding the psychology of the moment, did not try to imitate Jackson's dour intensity. Instead, he amplified his own cavalier persona. Dressed in his plumed hat and cape, Stuart rode the lines, singing a parody song at the top of his lungs. Old Joe Hooker, won't you come out of the wilderness? It was a performance of manic energy designed to distract the men from their grief. It worked. As the Confederate infantry launched their assault on the Union positions at Hazel Grove and Fairview, a chant began to rise from the ranks. It started in the Stonewall Brigade and spread like wildfire. Remember Jackson. Driven by a desire for vengeance, the Confederates fought with a ferocity that broke the Union line. Chancellorsville became Lee's greatest victory, a tactical masterpiece executed against overwhelming odds. But the cost was the soul of the Army. While Jackson's body was taken to Lexington for burial, his left arm remained behind. The Reverend Beverly Tucker Lacey, Jackson's chaplain, could not bear to see the limb thrown into a mass grave of amputated parts. He wrapped the arm in a cloth and carried it to his brother's nearby estate, Elwood Manor. There, in the private family cemetery, Lacey buried the arm of Stonewall Jackson. A simple stone marks the spot today. It is a lonely monument to the fragmentation of a man and a nation. The death of Jackson is often cited as the turning point of the Civil War. At Gettysburg, 2 months later, Lee found himself paralyzed by the hesitation of his new Corps commanders, Ewell and Hill. He famously lamented, "If I had had Jackson at Gettysburg, I would have won that battle." Jackson's death deprived Lee of his executive officer, the man who could translate Lee's broad, often vague strategic concepts into concrete, ruthless tactical action without needing detailed instructions. Without the stone wall, the Army of Northern Virginia lost its aggressive edge. In the end, the man who balanced his blood by raising his hand to the sky, who ate lemons in the face of death, and who saw the world through a rigid, perhaps neurodivergent lens, left a void that the Confederacy could not fill. He remains a figure of shadow and moonlight, forever riding into the darkness of the wilderness, crossing the river to a rest he never found in life.